I woke this morning and stood in my kitchen at 7:30, looking at the bread bin and the fridge with a familiar sense of unease that I have carried with me for the better part of 2 decades working in nutritional medicine at Imperial College London. My name is George Jones, and I have spent 20 years studying the relationship between dietary patterns and chronic disease outcomes in British populations, which means I have watched generations of patients pass through our clinics with preventable conditions that could have been addressed decades earlier had they known what I am about to share with you now. The British breakfast is not merely a meal, but a cultural institution woven into the fabric of our national identity, and I say this with profound respect for the traditions that have sustained families through wartime rationing, industrial revolution, and every social transformation this country has weathered. The full English breakfast represents warmth, comfort, and a certain defiant celebration of hearty eating that distinguishes us from lighter continental approaches, yet the version of this meal that most of us consume today in the year 2025 bears little resemblance to what our grandparents ate, and the health consequences of this transformation are written across every cardiovascular ward and diabetes clinic in the United Kingdom. When I speak with patients about breakfast choices, I encounter a predictable resistance rooted not in stubbornness but in genuine confusion about what constitutes healthy eating in an environment where food manufacturers spend billions of pounds annually convincing us that their products support our well-being. The supermarket aisles of Tesco, Sainsbury's ASDA, Waitrose, and Morrison's present us with thousands of breakfast options wrapped in packaging that screams vitality, natural goodness, and nutritional virtue, yet the ingredients lists tell a different story entirely, one written in sodium levels that would make your kidneys weep, sugar concentrations that rival confectionery, and processing methods that strip away the very nutrients these products claim to provide. I am not here to shame anyone for their food choices or to suggest that we abandon every cherished breakfast tradition, because that approach fails every time and leaves people feeling judged rather than empowered. But I am here to provide you with the evidence-based information that the food industry would prefer you did not scrutinize too carefully, and to offer realistic alternatives that honor British food culture while supporting the kind of health outcomes that allow you to enjoy a long and active life. The 8 foods I am going to examine in detail represent the most common breakfast items consumed across the United Kingdom according to national dietary surveys, and each one carries specific health risks that compound over time in ways that are not immediately apparent when you are simply trying to get out of the door on a Tuesday morning. These are not exotic or unusual foods, but rather the everyday staples that millions of British people rely upon without a second thought, and therein lies the problem. Because familiarity breeds complacency, and we assume that something sold in every corner shop and supermarket must be fundamentally safe even when the scientific literature tells us otherwise. I want to be clear from the outset that I am not advocating for a joyless existence devoid of pleasure or cultural connection to food, nor am I suggesting that a single serving of any of these items will cause immediate harm, but rather that the cumulative effect of daily consumption over years and decades contributes significantly to the chronic disease burden that now affects more than half of British adults and places unsustainable pressure on our National Health Service. The first food that requires our attention is the processed breakfast sausage, which has become so ubiquitous in British morning meals that we scarcely question what actually goes into these cylindrical packages of meat that sizzle so appealingly in the pan. When I ask patients to estimate the meat content of a typical supermarket sausage, they usually guess somewhere between 70 and 80%, but the reality is that many economy and standard range sausages contain as little as 42% actual meat, with the remainder consisting of water, rusk made from wheat flour, salt, preservatives, flavor enhancers, and in some cases mechanically recovered meat that bears little resemblance to the pork shoulder or beef cuts you might imagine. The sodium content alone should give us pause, because a single serving of 2 standard sausages can contain up to 1.8 grams of salt, which represents nearly a third of the recommended maximum daily intake of 6 grams for adults. And this is before you have added baked beans, bacon, or any of the other components of a full breakfast. What concerns me most from a cardiovascular perspective is the combination of saturated fat and sodium working synergistically to elevate blood pressure and contribute to arterial plaque formation, because saturated fat increases low-density lipoprotein cholesterol while sodium drives fluid retention and vascular resistance, creating a perfect storm for hypertension that affects 1 in 4 British adults and often goes undiagnosed until significant damage has already occurred. The preservatives used in processed sausages deserve particular scrutiny because they extend shelf life and maintain that appealing pink color, but they come with health costs that are increasingly well documented in epidemiological research. Sodium nitrite, listed as E250 on ingredient labels, has been the subject of considerable debate within the scientific community because whilst it effectively prevents bacterial growth and botulism risk, it also converts to nitrosamines in the digestive tract under certain conditions. And these compounds have been classified as probable human carcinogens by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Recent research demonstrated that higher nitrite intake from processed meats contributed to significant increases in diastolic blood pressure, with participants in the highest tertile of consumption showing blood pressure elevations of over 3 millimeters of mercury compared to those in the lowest tertile, and whilst that might sound modest, it translates to meaningful increases in stroke and heart attack risk when sustained over years. The study examined the interaction between nitrite intake and total sodium consumption, finding that the two factors work synergistically rather than independently, which means that a high-salt diet amplifies the blood pressure effects of nitrites in ways that make processed sausages particularly problematic for anyone with existing cardiovascular risk factors. What frustrates me as a clinician is that perfectly acceptable alternatives exist that would allow people to continue enjoying sausages as part of their breakfast without exposing themselves to these risks, but they require a willingness to spend slightly more and to read ingredient labels with a critical eye. Premium butcher sausages with meat content above 90% and minimal additives cost perhaps 50 pence more per pack than economy versions, but they provide substantially better protein quality, lower sodium levels, and fewer synthetic preservatives, and when you calculate the long-term health costs of cardiovascular disease treatment, that 50 pence represents exceptional value. Some supermarket ranges have begun responding to consumer pressure by offering nitrite-free bacon and sausages, with Waitrose and Marks & Spencer leading the way in this regard, though you must still check labels carefully because marketing claims about natural or traditional production methods do not always translate to healthier formulations. For those willing to explore plant-based alternatives, brands such as Richmond, Linda McCartney, and Quorn now produce meat-free sausages that replicate the taste and texture of pork sausages remarkably well whilst delivering substantially lower saturated fat content and zero nitrites. And I say this as someone who was deeply skeptical about such products until I actually tried them and recognized that they represent a genuine option rather than a compromise. The second food demanding our attention is mass-produced white bread, which forms the foundation of the British breakfast toast ritual and yet represents one of the clearest examples of how industrial food processing can transform a potentially nutritious staple into something that actively undermines metabolic health. Bread has sustained human civilizations for millennia, and whole grain varieties continue to offer genuine nutritional benefits, but the sliced white bread that dominates supermarket shelves has been so thoroughly refined and processed that it retains almost none of the fiber, vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients present in the whole wheat grain from which it theoretically derives. The glycemic index of white bread sits at 75, which places it firmly in the high category and means that it causes rapid spikes in blood glucose followed by equally rapid crashes that leave you feeling hungry and fatigued within 2 hours of eating, creating a metabolic rollercoaster that over time contributes to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. When I explain to patients that white bread produces a blood sugar response almost identical to pure glucose, they look at me with genuine surprise because bread seems so wholesome and innocent compared to sweets or sugary drinks. But the reality is that the refining process removes the bran and germ that would otherwise slow digestion and glucose absorption, leaving behind predominantly starch that your body converts to sugar almost immediately. The fiber content of white bread averages less than 3 grams per 100 grams compared to approximately 7 to 9 grams in wholemeal or granary varieties, and this difference matters enormously for digestive health, cholesterol management, and appetite regulation because soluble fiber binds to bile acids in the intestine and promotes their excretion, forcing the liver to synthesize new bile acids from cholesterol and thereby lowering blood cholesterol levels. Populations consuming high-fiber diets consistently demonstrate lower rates of cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, and obesity, yet the average British adult consumes only about 18 grams of fiber daily against a recommended intake of 30 grams, and our breakfast bread choices contribute significantly to this shortfall. The fortification of white bread with calcium and B vitamins, which manufacturers tout as evidence of nutritional value, represents a crude attempt to replace what the refining process destroyed, rather like stripping a house down to its frame and then adding a coat of paint and calling it restored. These synthetic nutrients do not provide the same health benefits as the complex matrix of compounds present in whole grains, which include lignans, phenolic acids, and other bioactive substances that work synergistically to reduce inflammation and oxidative stress throughout the body. What particularly concerns me about white bread consumption is its contribution to the overall dietary pattern that promotes weight gain and metabolic dysfunction, because people rarely eat bread in isolation but rather as part of meals that often include other refined carbohydrates and sources of saturated fat. The classic British breakfast of white toast with butter and jam delivers a massive glucose and insulin spike with minimal protein or fiber to moderate the response, and this pattern repeated daily for years creates the kind of chronic hyperinsulinemia that drives fat storage, particularly around the abdomen where it poses the greatest metabolic risk. Research from Imperial College London examining breakfast timing and composition has demonstrated that what you eat matters as much as when you eat it, and meals dominated by refined carbohydrates without adequate protein or fiber set you up for poor food choices throughout the rest of the day because they fail to provide sustained satiety. The solution here is not to abandon bread entirely, because that would be both unrealistic and unnecessary, but rather to transition to genuinely whole grain options that provide the nutrients and fiber your body requires. When I say whole grain, I mean bread where the first ingredient listed is wholemeal flour or whole wheat flour rather than wheat flour, because manufacturers exploit consumer confusion by using terms like brown bread or multigrain to describe products that are predominantly refined white flour with caramel coloring or a handful of seeds added for appearance. Granary bread, seeded batch loaves, and true wholemeal bread from supermarket bakery sections or independent bakeries offer substantially better nutritional profiles with glycemic index values in the low to medium range, meaning they produce gentler blood sugar responses that sustain energy levels for longer periods. Sourdough bread represents another excellent option because the fermentation process partially breaks down the starch and gluten, reducing the glycemic response whilst improving digestibility and creating beneficial organic acids that support gut health. These alternatives cost no more than premium white bread brands and in many cases are cheaper than artisanal white sourdough that has become fashionable in recent years, so the barrier to making this change is purely habitual rather than economic. The third food requiring examination is sugary breakfast cereal, and this category represents perhaps the most egregious example of successful marketing convincing entire generations that a highly processed food product constitutes a nutritious start to the day. The breakfast cereal aisle in any British supermarket contains hundreds of products adorned with health claims about whole grain content, added vitamins, and energy provision, yet many of these same products contain sugar levels that would make them more accurately classified as confectionery. Research examining children's cereals ranked by sugar content found that popular brands such as Frosties, Cocoa Pops, and Crunchy Nut contained between 25 and 37 grams of sugar per 100 grams, meaning that a typical 30-gram serving delivers between 7 and 11 grams of sugar, which represents roughly a quarter of the maximum daily recommendation for free sugars intake for adults and a third of the recommendation for children aged 4 to 6. When Dear Chris Van Tulliken analysed Cocoa Pops for his book Ultra-Processed People, he found that despite the manufacturer having halved the sugar content in response to public pressure, the cereal still contained 20% more salt per gram than a typical microwave lasagna. Because this extraordinary saltiness helps to make heavily processed cereals taste amazing by amplifying flavour perception and driving consumption. The sugar content of breakfast cereals has declined modestly over the past 5 years in response to Public Health England's sugar reduction program, but this improvement still leaves most popular brands well above levels that could be considered healthy, and manufacturers have compensated by increasing other ingredients that maintain palatability and encourage overconsumption. When I ask patients to estimate how much cereal they actually pour into their bowl, they typically describe a serving size of 30 grams, which is the amount used for nutritional labeling, but when we measure their actual portions, they average closer to 50 or 60 grams, meaning they are consuming substantially more sugar and calories than they realize. This portion distortion is not accidental but rather engineered into the product design because breakfast cereals are formulated to be highly palatable and low in satiety, meaning they taste delicious but leave you feeling hungry again quickly, which serves the manufacturer's interest in encouraging frequent consumption. The type of sugar used in breakfast cereals varies by brand and includes sucrose, glucose syrup, corn syrup, honey, and concentrated fruit juices, all of which contribute to the free sugars total that the World Health Organization recommends limiting to less than 10% of daily energy intake and ideally less than 5%. Free sugars are those added to foods by manufacturers or consumed as honey, syrups, and fruit juices, and they are distinguished from the naturally occurring sugars in whole fruits and milk because they lack the fiber, protein, and other nutrients that moderate their metabolic impact. When you consume free sugars in the quantities present in sugary cereals, you overwhelm your liver's capacity to process fructose, leading to de novo lipogenesis where excess sugar is converted directly into fat and stored in the liver itself, contributing to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that now affects approximately 1 in 3 British adults. The irony is that many breakfast cereals marketed to children feature cartoon characters, bright colors, and messaging about energy and strength. Yet they are setting children up for a lifetime of poor metabolic health by training their palates to expect high levels of sweetness and by establishing eating patterns that prioritize convenience and palatability over nutritional quality. The fourth food that warrants detailed examination is standard supermarket bacon, which occupies such a central place in British breakfast culture that suggesting its removal from the full English feels almost sacrilegious. Yet the evidence concerning nitrites in cured meats has become so compelling in recent years that even scientists who contributed to the original World Health Organization classification are now calling for tobacco-style health warnings on bacon packaging. In August 2025, testing commissioned by the Coalition Against Nitrites revealed that Wiltshire ham and bacon products sold at major supermarkets including Tesco, Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury's and Morrisons contained notably high concentrations of nitrites, with Tesco's Wiltshire ham measuring almost 33 milligrams per kilogram, which is more than 10 times the amount found in their own cooked ham and nearly 18 times the amount detected in Morrisons bacon. These findings emerged nearly a full decade after the World Health Organization classified nitrite-cured processed meats as Group 1 carcinogens in October 2015, placing them in the same category as tobacco, smoke, and asbestos in terms of strength of evidence linking them to cancer, though not equivalence of risk. The specific concern with bacon relates to how nitrites behave when subjected to high heat during frying, because they react with amino acids in the meat to form nitrosamines, which are among the most potent carcinogenic compounds known to toxicology. Research published by scientists who contributed to the original WHO ruling suggests that nitrites in processed meats have caused approximately 54,000 cases of colorectal cancer in the United Kingdom over the past decade, representing a substantial and preventable disease burden that has cost the National Health Service an estimated £3 billion in treatment costs. When we examine the dose-response relationship, we find that consuming just 50 grams of processed meat daily, which represents roughly 3 rashers of bacon, increases bowel cancer risk by approximately 18%, meaning that lifetime risk rises from 6 in 100 people to 7 in 100. This might sound like a modest increase until you consider that it applies across the entire population, translating to thousands of additional cancer cases annually that could be prevented through dietary modification. The challenge I face when discussing this with patients is that bacon consumption is deeply embedded in British food culture and weekend rituals, so recommending complete elimination feels both unrealistic and likely to be ignored, which is why I instead advocate for a harm reduction approach that acknowledges the evidence whilst respecting cultural practices. What frustrates me most about this situation is that perfectly viable alternatives exist that would allow the bacon industry to continue operating while substantially reducing public health harm. Because nitrites are not essential for food safety in the modern refrigerated supply chain, but rather serve primarily to maintain the characteristic pink color and cured flavor that consumers expect from bacon. Several premium manufacturers, including those supplying Waitrose and Marks & Spencer, have begun producing nitrite-free bacon that relies instead on natural preservation methods and acceptance that cured meat might look slightly grey rather than bright pink, yet these products remain niche offerings rather than mainstream options. The Telegraph conducted an investigation in January 2025 examining the healthiest supermarket bacon options and found that choosing back bacon over streaky bacon reduces saturated fat content substantially, while selecting medallion bacon with visible fat removed represents an even better choice for those unwilling to abandon bacon entirely. The reality is that if you consume bacon once weekly as part of a leisurely weekend breakfast rather than daily as part of your routine, the incremental cancer risk becomes negligible compared to other dietary and lifestyle factors. But daily consumption over decades represents a genuinely concerning exposure pattern that I cannot in good conscience endorse. The fifth food requiring our attention is fried eggs cooked in oil, and I recognize that this might seem unnecessarily restrictive given that eggs themselves are nutrient-dense foods providing high-quality protein, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals, but the cooking method matters enormously for cardiovascular health outcomes. Research examining the relationship between egg consumption and metabolic syndrome found that fried egg intake showed a positive association with metabolic syndrome odds, with participants consuming more than half an egg daily via frying demonstrating significantly elevated risk compared to those eating fried eggs less than once weekly, whereas non-fried egg consumption showed no such association. The mechanism behind this difference relates to what happens when oils are heated to high temperatures in the presence of cholesterol-containing foods, because oxidation reactions occur that generate lipid peroxides and oxysterols, which are far more atherogenic than the native cholesterol found in uncooked eggs. When I explain to patients that the cholesterol in eggs has been largely exonerated by modern research and that dietary cholesterol has much less impact on blood cholesterol than we previously believed, they understandably feel confused about why I am now concerned about fried eggs specifically. But the issue is not the egg itself, but rather the chemical transformations that occur during high heat cooking in oil. Studies examining different cooking methods have demonstrated that frying increases the cholesterol content of meat products on a wet weight basis because moisture evaporates during cooking, concentrating the remaining components including cholesterol and fat. Whilst on a dry weight basis, the cholesterol content may actually decrease as some migrates into the cooking oil. The type of oil used for frying also influences outcomes, with research showing that olive oil does not significantly worsen the cholesterol profile compared to frying without added oil, but this does not mean that frying in olive oil is optimal, merely that it is less harmful than some alternatives. The Pearson correlation analyses from these studies revealed significant relationships between cholesterol content, moisture loss, and fat content during frying, confirming that the cooking process fundamentally alters the nutritional profile of eggs in ways that increase cardiovascular risk. What concerns me from a public health perspective is that fried eggs represent the default cooking method for most British households preparing a cooked breakfast because frying is quick and produces the crispy edges and runny yolks that people find appealing. But this convenience comes at a metabolic cost that accumulates over years of daily consumption. The solution here is remarkably simple and requires no sacrifice in terms of taste or satiety because poached eggs, boiled eggs, and scrambled eggs prepared with minimal butter or a light spray of oil provide all the nutritional benefits of eggs without the oxidative damage associated with high heat frying in pools of oil. Poaching eggs in simmering water preserves the delicate structure of the yolk whilst cooking the white to a safe temperature, and whilst it requires slightly more attention than simply cracking an egg into a hot pan, the technique becomes second nature with practice and produces a far superior texture. Boiled eggs offer even greater convenience because they can be prepared in advance and kept refrigerated for several days, making them ideal for busy mornings when you need protein but lack time for elaborate cooking, and they travel well for packed lunches or workplace breakfasts. For those who genuinely prefer the taste and texture of fried eggs, I suggest using an oil spray rather than pouring oil into the pan, which reduces the quantity of fat substantially while still preventing sticking, and cooking at moderate rather than high heat to minimize oxidation reactions. The key principle is that eggs themselves are excellent breakfast foods that provide sustained energy and satiety far superior to refined carbohydrates, but the preparation method determines whether they contribute to or undermine your long-term cardiovascular health. The sixth food that demands scrutiny is flavored yogurt and breakfast yogurt pots, which present themselves as healthy dairy options supporting bone health and digestive function through probiotic bacteria, yet contain sugar levels that rival desserts and undermine these purported benefits. Comprehensive surveys examining yogurt products sold in major UK supermarkets have revealed that total sugar content is relatively high across all categories except natural and Greek yogurts, with children's yogurts containing a median of 10.8 grams per 100 grams, fruit yogurts 11.9 grams per 100 grams, flavored yogurts 12 grams per 100 grams, and organic yogurts 13.1 grams per 100 grams. The dessert category predictably showed the highest sugar content with a median of 16.4 grams per 100 grams and a range extending to 32.6 grams in some products. But what surprises most people is that many yogurts marketed as healthy breakfast options contain only marginally less sugar than these acknowledged desserts. When researchers examined 101 children's yogurt and fromage frais products, they found that only 2 qualified as low sugar according to the threshold of 5 grams per 100 grams or less, meaning that 98% of yogurt specifically marketed to children and parents exceeded the level that would allow a low sugar nutrition claim on front of pack labeling. The distinction between total sugars and added sugars matters here because natural yogurt contains lactose, which is the sugar naturally present in milk and typically accounts for approximately 5 grams per 100 grams in unsweetened products, meaning that flavored yogurts with 12 grams total sugar contain roughly 7 grams of added sugar per 100 gram serving. A typical single-serve yogurt pot contains between 150 and 200 grams, which means consuming an entire pot delivers between 10 and 14 grams of added sugar, representing a quarter to a third of the maximum daily free sugars recommendation for adults. The food industry has responded to public health pressure by reformulating some products to reduce sugar content, but consumer acceptance research demonstrates that people reject yogurts with 5% added sugar or less as too sour, preferring products with 10 to 13% added sugar, which creates a commercial incentive to maintain sugar levels that undermine health. Interestingly, when French researchers gave participants plain natural yogurt and allowed them to add sugar themselves, they added an average of 13.6 grams, which is more than the total content of many commercial sweetened yogurts, suggesting that our collective palate has been trained to expect excessive sweetness in dairy products. The low-fat yogurt category deserves particular attention because these products are often perceived as the healthiest choice, yet the survey data revealed that whilst low-fat yogurts contained less than 3 grams of fat per 100 grams, 55% of them contained between 10 and 20 grams of sugar per 100 grams because manufacturers compensate for the reduced palatability of fat removal by increasing sugar content. This represents a classic example of nutritionism gone wrong, where focusing on a single nutrient in isolation leads to unintended consequences elsewhere in the formulation, and consumers end up with products that are technically low in fat but high in something potentially more harmful to metabolic health. The organic yogurt category also challenges assumptions because despite the health halo surrounding organic certification, these products showed some of the highest median sugar contents across all categories examined, reminding us that organic does not automatically mean healthy or lower in sugar. What I find most concerning is how yogurt manufacturers have successfully positioned their products as virtuous breakfast choices through marketing emphasis in calcium, probiotics, and protein, whilst downplaying sugar content that would cause alarm if found in other food categories. The solution is to choose natural or Greek yogurt with no added sugar and to add your own fresh or frozen berries, which provide natural sweetness along with fiber, vitamins, and polyphenols that are absent from the fruit preparations used in commercial yogurts. A 150-gram serving of natural Greek yogurt contains approximately 7 to 8 grams of naturally occurring lactose and delivers substantially more protein than flavored alternatives, typically 15 to 20 grams compared to 8 to 10 grams in sweetened versions. If you find unsweetened yogurt too tart initially, I suggest gradually reducing your reliance on PRE-sweetened products rather than switching abruptly, because your taste receptors will adapt over several weeks and foods that once seemed bland will begin to taste pleasantly tangy. Adding a small drizzle of honey or a teaspoon of jam to natural yogurt gives you control over sweetness levels and will almost certainly result in lower total sugar intake than relying on PRE-flavored products, whilst brands like Phage, Total, and supermarket-owned brand Greek yogurts offer excellent nutritional profiles at reasonable prices. The seventh food requiring examination is instant porridge sachets with added flavorings, which seem like a convenient and wholesome breakfast option that honours Scotland's oat heritage whilst fitting into busy modern schedules. Yet these products often contain surprising amounts of added sugar and lack the nutritional completeness of traditional rolled oats prepared properly. Popular instant porridge sachets such as Quaker Oats, so simple in golden syrup flavor, contain 24.5 grams of sugar per 100 grams, meaning that a single 36-gram sachet delivers approximately 8.8 grams of sugar, which represents nearly a quarter of the maximum daily free sugars recommendation. Mornflake instant porridge in similar flavors shows comparable sugar content, and whilst these products do contain oats and therefore provide some fiber and complex carbohydrates, the added sugar undermines the blood glucose benefits that plain oats would otherwise deliver. The convenience of instant sachets comes at the cost of both nutritional quality and economic value, because traditional rolled oats cost substantially less per serving and require only marginally more preparation time. Typically 3 to 4 minutes of microwave cooking or overnight soaking compared to 2 to 3 minutes for instant sachets. What frustrates me about instant porridge products is that oats themselves are genuinely excellent breakfast foods that provide beta-glucan-soluble fiber proven to lower cholesterol, stabilize blood sugar, and promote satiety lasting several hours, but coating them in sugar and artificial flavorings transforms them into something far less beneficial. Some manufacturers have recognized this problem and now offer no added sugar instant porridge options, with brands like Moma Foods producing sachets made from 79% British jumbo oats and traditional porridge oats blended with skimmed milk powder and nothing else, which represents a far superior choice for those who value convenience. These unflavored instant options contain only the naturally occurring sugars present in milk powder and allow you to add your own toppings such as sliced banana, berries, nuts, or a small amount of honey or maple syrup, giving you control over both sweetness and nutritional content. Traditional Scottish porridge prepared from rolled oats or steel-cut oats with water or milk and a pinch of salt represents the gold standard, because it preserves the full nutritional integrity of the whole grain whilst costing perhaps 20 pence per serving compared to 50 pence or more for branded instant sachets. The eighth and final food that warrants examination is overly sweetened tea and coffee drinks, which might seem like a peculiar inclusion in a discussion of breakfast foods. Yet hot beverage consumption represents such a fundamental component of British morning routines that the sugar added to these drinks contributes significantly to daily free sugars intake. Research by the Oral Health Foundation found that 1 in 3 British adults add sugar to their hot drinks, with 1 in 8 adding 2 teaspoons of sugar per cup and approximately 1 in 30 adding more than 3 teaspoons, and given that each teaspoon contains 4 grams of sugar, people adding 2 teaspoons or more could be exceeding NHS sugar intake recommendations through this hidden source alone. The arithmetic becomes alarming when you consider consumption patterns, because if someone drinks 4 cups of tea or coffee daily with 1 teaspoon of sugar in each, they consume 16 grams of sugar from beverages alone, which represents more than half the maximum daily recommendation of 30 grams for adults. What makes this particularly insidious is that liquid sugars fail to trigger satiety mechanisms in the same way that solid foods do, meaning that the calories from sweetened hot drinks do not reduce your appetite for other foods and therefore represent pure additions to daily energy intake. The rise of takeaway coffee culture has compounded this problem because the flavored lattes, cappuccinos, and specialty coffee drinks sold at chains across the UK often contain multiple pumps of syrup delivering 15 to 20 grams of sugar per serving. And many customers consume these drinks alongside pastries or breakfast sandwiches without recognizing the cumulative sugar load. British tea culture traditionally involved modest amounts of milk and perhaps one small spoon of sugar, but contemporary coffee consumption patterns have shifted towards drinks that more closely resemble desserts than simple caffeinated beverages. And this transition has occurred so gradually that we have failed to recognize its metabolic implications. Interestingly, research examining sugar use in coffee and tea in Danish populations found that adding sugar to these beverages was not significantly associated with increased mortality risk when controlling for other lifestyle factors. But the researchers noted that the average amount of sugar added per cup was only 5 grams, compared to 25 grams in a typical can of sugar-sweetened beverage, suggesting that dose matters enormously. This finding does not provide license for unlimited sugar in hot drinks, but rather suggests that if you must sweeten your tea or coffee, using minimal amounts may not carry the same health risks as consuming multiple cans of soft drinks daily. The solution here involves gradual reduction rather than immediate elimination, because research demonstrates that taste preferences adapt over time and that people who slowly reduce sugar in their hot drinks eventually find fully sweetened versions unpalatably sweet. I suggest reducing by a quarter teaspoon every 2 weeks until you reach 0, which allows your palate to adjust without feeling deprived, and choosing higher quality tea and coffee that has inherent flavor complexity rather than relying on sugar to mask bitterness from cheap products. Properly brewed black tea using loose leaf or quality tea bags from brands like Twinings, Yorkshire Tea, or PG Tips delivers complex flavors that genuinely benefit from only a splash of milk without any sugar. And the ritual of preparing tea well can become its own form of morning mindfulness that enhances rather than detracts from the experience. For coffee drinkers, investing in freshly ground beans and proper brewing equipment transforms the beverage from something that requires sweetening into something that tastes genuinely delicious, black or with minimal milk. And whilst the upfront cost is higher, the per-cup expense quickly becomes lower than daily takeaway purchases whilst delivering superior health outcomes and environmental benefits.